Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the medieval world. So dim the light, get cozy, maybe tuck yourself under something warmer than a scratchy wool blanket, because tonight's topic is sleep. Specifically, how did people in the Middle Ages survive the freezing, bone-rattling winters inside huts made mostly of wood, mud, and hope? It's a fun little paradox. When we imagine medieval Europe, we think castles, roaring fireplaces, knights clanking around in armor. But most people weren't knights, and they definitely weren't living in stone fortresses. They were peasants, and peasants lived in huts. Huts that were about as good at keeping in heat as your grandma's wicker laundry basket. So tonight, let's wander through the creaking door of one of these wooden homes, breathe in that wonderful mix of smoke and livestock odor, and figure out how anyone managed to not freeze to death while trying to get some rest. Spoiler alert, a lot of them probably did freeze to death, but let's not get too bleak too fast. First, picture the hut. We're not talking IKEA log cabins here. No polished timbers, no pine-scented interiors. A medieval hut was usually a single room, sometimes with a little partition if the family was feeling fancy. The walls were wood if they were lucky, but more often a mix of timber frames stuffed with wattle and daub, basically twigs plastered with mud, straw, and animal poop, because nothing says luxury insulation like cow dung. The floor? Dirt. Just dirt. If you dropped your bread, congratulations, you were eating dirt bread now. And yes, that includes while trying to sleep, because beds weren't always elevated. A lot of people literally slept on straw piles spread on the ground, which is fine until you remember that straw attracts mice, rats, and fleas. So while you're shivering, you're also providing a buffet for your local parasite community. Now roofs, thatch was common. Bundles of straw layered into a vaguely waterproof lid. Problem? It leaked. Problem number 2? It had the insulation power of soggy cardboard. So, you've got wind sneaking in through cracks in the walls, rain dripping on your straw mattress, and your main defense against this is piling another blanket of wool that smells like wet sheep over yourself. Cozy, right?
Fire, the medieval radiator. Now, technically, people did have fires, usually just one. In the center of the hut, you'd have a hearth. No chimney, just an opening in the roof for smoke to kind of, maybe, float out if the wind was feeling generous. Otherwise, you and your family were basically cold smoked like sausages. The fire helped, but wood was expensive, and gathering it took time. So people didn't just toss logs around like in a Netflix fireplace video. They rationed it, which means small, smoky fires that heated, well, mostly the ceiling. Heat rises. The people lying on the dirt floor, not so much. At night, the fire often burned down to embers. So unless you had someone dedicated to getting up every hour to poke it back to life, and who wants that job? You were left with a gradually freezing room. This is why most people didn't sleep alone. Which brings us to the next part. The let's huddle method. Forget personal space. Medieval people slept in groups. Families piled together, children sandwiched between adults, grandparents shoved on the side, and maybe even a servant or two if you had one. Everyone layered on their shared blankets pressed so tightly that rolling over probably involved a negotiation. The logic was simple. Body heat. One person under a thin blanket equals frozen popsicle. 5 people under the same blanket equals a slightly warmer human-scented oven. It was efficient, if not exactly comfortable. Imagine your dad snoring next to you, your brother kicking in his sleep, and the family dog scratching fleas at your feet. Congratulations, you're in a medieval hut and it's 3 a.m. And yes, animals were often inside too, not for fun, but for warmth. Sheep, goats, chickens, even cows might be kept in the same hut during winter nights. The logic again, more warm bodies. Of course, this also meant more noise, more smells, and the occasional surprise when your bed straw got, well, fertilized. Medieval fashion, sleep edition. So what did people actually wear to sleep? Pajamas didn't exist. Rich folks had nightshirts, but the average peasant? You wore what you already had. Linen underclothes, maybe an extra wool tunic, whatever kept you warm. Taking clothes off to sleep was a luxury reserved for people with actual heating. Some people even wrapped their feet in rags before bed, like medieval socks. Not comfortable, but it beat waking up with frostbite toes. Head coverings were common too. A simple cap or scarf could keep in a surprising amount of heat. Basically, if you've ever fallen asleep wearing 3 sweaters and a hoodie, congratulations, you've just recreated the medieval sleep experience.
The two-sleep system. Here's a fun little fact. People back then didn't always sleep straight through the night. They had what's called segmented sleep, basically first sleep and second sleep. The cold and darkness encouraged early bedtimes, like right after sunset. People would drift off, wake up around midnight when the fire needed tending or when they'd simply had enough of shivering, and then maybe chat, pray, snack, or do marital things before falling back into a second sleep until dawn. Imagine rolling over at 1 a.m., nudging your freezing spouse and whispering, "Hey, since we're awake anyway." And yes, historians think this actually boosted nighttime intimacy, because nothing says romance like being half awake, half frozen, and surrounded by livestock. A note on smell. Let's not sugarcoat it. These huts stank. Smoke clung to everything. Straw mattresses rotted. Livestock were not known for their perfume. And with no real ventilation, the combination of body odor, damp wool, and manure created what we'll politely call a strong aroma. Did people care? Not really. Everyone was used to it. Your nose just tuned it out after a while. But imagine crawling into bed tonight with no shower, no clean sheets, and a goat chewing cud 6 feet away. You'd miss Febreze pretty fast. But wait, what about the rich? Because of course there were always exceptions. Nobles and kings didn't live like this. Castles had larger fireplaces, actual beds with frames and layers of thick blankets. Did they still get called? Yes. Stone castles were drafty nightmares, and heating a massive hall with one fireplace is like trying to heat a gymnasium with a candle. But at least they weren't sleeping in dirt huts with cows. The nobility often slept in curtained beds, which created a sort of microclimate of warmth. Imagine a 4-poster bed with heavy drapes trapping in body heat. It was still cold, but less likely to result in your toes falling off overnight. So yes, wealth made things better. But for the majority, the peasants in their smoky, straw-filled huts, sleep was less restful slumber and more barely surviving the night. And that's our first stroll into the freezing medieval night. Next up, we'll keep exploring the strange little details of how people actually lived in these huts, from bedding materials to what kids did, and why medieval dreams might have been even weirder than the sleep itself.
All right, so we've set the scene. It's winter, you're in a hut that smells like smoke and goat, and you're trying to sleep in the medieval world. Now let's zoom in on the details. Specifically, what were people actually sleeping on? How did kids fit into this frosty equation? And what did people do in the middle of the night when they couldn't sleep? Because here's the thing, when you don't have central heating, Spotify sleep playlists, or even a blanket that doesn't smell faintly of mildew, bedtime gets creative. Straw beds, the crunchy mattress. Let's start with the bed. Calling it a bed might be generous. For peasants, it was often just a pile of straw on the dirt floor. Straw was cheap, abundant, and bonus, it didn't kill you if you rolled onto it, unlike rocks. But straw had problems. It flattened quickly, so you had to keep replacing it. It also itched, poked, and harbored all the delightful creatures of the medieval insect kingdom. Fleas loved straw. So did lice. And if your pig had a little wander through the house, well, your bedding now had a few bonus smells. People sometimes covered straw with a rough linen sheet, if they could afford the cloth. But linen was expensive. More often, you were just lying straight on the crunchy stuff. Imagine every move you make sounding like you're rustling a paper bag. Romantic. The luxury of a real bed. If you were slightly better off, a prosperous peasant, a town merchant, you might actually have a bed frame. Wood, maybe a rope lattice stretched across to hold a mattress stuffed with straw, reeds, or feathers if you were really lucky. Feather beds, the medieval equivalent of memory foam. Only nobles usually had them. And yes, they were actually prized enough to be listed in wills. To my eldest daughter, I leave the feather bed. Forget land or jewelry. Fluffy sleep was the real inheritance. But even with a frame, warmth was the main problem. Blankets were wool, heavy and scratchy. Multiple layers were piled on, sometimes so many that people joked about not being able to move once you got under them. Which was fine because rolling over in a group bed would have been a diplomatic incident anyway. Kids in the mix. Now, imagine you're a medieval child. Your bedtime isn't about choosing which stuffed animal to hug. It's about squeezing in between adults so you don't freeze. Babies often slept in the same bed as their parents, partly for warmth, partly because there weren't cribs in peasant huts. That did mean infant smothering was a risk, but so was freezing alone in a cradle. Pick your tragedy. Older kids, they just piled in with the rest of the family. Privacy wasn't a thing. If your parents decided to, create more siblings during the night, you probably just rolled over and pretended to be asleep. Childhood trauma wasn't really cataloged in the records, but let's be honest, it happened. And then there were orphans, apprentices, or servants. In many households, the kids not directly related might just sleep on benches, in lofts, or literally on the floor near the fire. Sweet dreams, Timmy. Enjoy inhaling smoke all night. Nighttime routines. So what actually happened at night, besides everyone trying not to shiver themselves awake? Well, remember that whole 2 sleeps thing from earlier? After the first sleep, people often woke up around midnight. And what do you do when you're awake in a smoky hut in the middle of winter? Tend the fire. Someone had to poke it and add a log or just make sure the place didn't go completely dark. Nobody liked waking up to frozen water jugs indoors. Household chores. Weirdly, this was prime time for things like mending clothes, carding wool, or even grinding grain. Candlelight was expensive, but if you were awake anyway, you might as well use the hours. Prayer. Religious devotion was a nighttime classic. Midnight prayers, chanting, or just muttering about how much your toes hurt. Talking. Families actually use this in-between time for conversation. Imagine it. The hut is dark. Everyone half buried under blankets, just quietly chatting about the day. No phones, no Netflix, just gossip about your neighbor's pig wandering into church again. Marital relations. Yeah, the midnight slot was prime baby-making time. Something about waking up after the first sleep put people in the mood. Historians note this so often it's almost funny. Apparently, freezing cold, itchy wool, and a goat staring at you was the medieval version of candlelit romance. Dreams, smoke, and semi-poisoning. Another fun fact. All that smoke in huts without chimneys, it didn't just sting your eyes, it filled the room. Night after night of breathing in wood smoke basically meant low-grade carbon monoxide exposure. Not enough to kill most people, but definitely enough to mess with your sleep. So if medieval dreams seemed especially vivid, part of it may have been literal smoke inhalation. Imagine trying to sleep while your brain is gently deprived of oxygen. No wonder dreams were interpreted as mystical visions. Sometimes it wasn't divine intervention, it was just your hut slowly suffocating you. The soundscape of medieval night. And let's not forget the noise. Forget the romantic idea of silent medieval villages. Nights were loud. Dogs barking, roosters deciding 2 a.m. was the perfect time to test their lungs, livestock shifting around inside the hut, plus your own family snoring, coughing, scratching, whispering. If you somehow slept through that, congratulations, you were probably deaf. Everyone else, you got used to it. Noise was part of life. Nobody expected silence. That's probably why bedtime prayers always included asking for a peaceful night, because peace was the last thing they were getting. Wealth gap, the noble version. Again,
Meanwhile, back in castles, the wealthy were experimenting with things like warming pans, little metal trays filled with hot coals that you slid between the sheets before bed. Sounds fancy, but also a little terrifying. Nothing like the constant risk of setting your feather bed on fire to lull you to sleep. Nobles also had bed curtains, which helped keep warmth in and gave a sense of privacy in crowded castle halls. Because yes, even nobles sometimes shared rooms with retainers, guards, or visiting relatives. True solo sleeping was rare. Even kings usually had attendants within earshot. In short, sleep in the medieval winter wasn't restful. It was survival. It was noise, stink, and cold with a dash of dreamlike weirdness from smoke poisoning. And yet, people adapted. They didn't know any better. And compared to working 16 hours in a frozen field, collapsing onto a pile of straw probably felt like heaven.
So far, we've been inside the hut. But let's step back and ask the bigger question. Why were medieval winters so awful in the first place? Because Europe has winters now. And yes, they can be rough. But you and I aren't usually waking up to frost on our blankets inside the house. Back then, though, frost indoors was practically a decorative feature. Turns out, the medieval climate wasn't exactly cooperating. Let's unpack that. Slowly, gently, like peeling back another layer of scratchy wool. The Little Ice Age. One of the biggest culprits behind brutal winters was the so-called Little Ice Age. Now, to be clear, this wasn't one solid block of freezing centuries. It was more like a very long, very bad weather mood swing that Europe suffered from roughly the 1300s through the 1800s. Cold snaps, endless snow, rivers freezing solid, the kind of climate shift that made every peasant mutter, "Seriously?" while trying to milk a frozen cow. Back then, though, frost indoors was practically a decorative feature. Turns out, the medieval climate wasn't exactly cooperating. Let's unpack that. Slowly, gently, like peeling back another layer of scratchy wool. On the frozen rivers, there were campuses of actors putting on shows, protesters criticizing the king, and even a disaster. One time, the stand-ins shifted unexpectedly, and some shops and stalls went crashing through the ice. Now, that would make a harrowing story to tell around the warm fire. But surviving that,
Cold for the rich, too. Now, you might think kings and nobles had it better. And yes, in many ways they did. But stone castles were not cozy. The walls were thick, sure, but also freezing cold to the touch. Heating one giant hall with a single fireplace was like trying to heat a cathedral with a toaster. There are plenty of accounts of nobles complaining about the cold. They slept with furs, feather beds, and draped curtains, but still woke up with ice forming on the inside walls. Royal servants sometimes had to break ice off the wash basins in the morning. Imagine being the King of France and still having to crack your water like you're camping. Even monasteries, supposedly centers of order and learning, were freezing. Monks wrote about ink freezing in their inkwells, which means, yes, some medieval manuscripts were written by half-frozen monks trying to copy scripture while their fingers went numb. Truly holy suffering. Clothing as survival gear. So, sleeping in winter wasn't just about beds and huts. It was about what you wore. Winter clothing meant layers upon layers. Wool tunics, cloaks, leggings, fur linings if you had the money. For peasants, warm clothing usually meant whatever's left that doesn't have holes. Nighttime wardrobes were basically just keeping all that on. Sleep naked the way we sometimes do today? Absolutely not. You'd be an icicle before dawn. Hats were practically mandatory. There's a reason medieval art loves showing people in little nightcaps. They weren't fashion statements. They were survival. Food, or lack thereof. Another reason winter nights felt so brutal was food shortages. Farming was seasonal, and storage was limited. You had some grain, maybe some salted meat if rodents hadn't found it first. By late winter, the so-called hunger gaps set in. Old supplies were running out, but new crops weren't ready. So people went to bed not just cold, but hungry. And when you're hungry, your body struggles to stay warm. Double misery.
If you've ever tried to sleep without dinner, you know how restless it feels. Now imagine doing that in a freezing hut while your neighbor's cow breathes louder than your father snores. Candlelight and darkness. Modern winters are softened by electric lights. Not so in the medieval world. Once the sun went down, that was it. Maybe you had a tallow candle if you were lucky. More likely, you sat in near darkness, which made the cold feel even worse. Going to bed early wasn't just because people were tired. It was because there was nothing else to do. No light to work by, no entertainment beyond conversation or music, so you just curled up in the straw and hoped unconsciousness came quickly.
Health effects of the cold. And yes, people did die from the cold. Hypothermia wasn't a diagnosed condition, but plenty of deaths came from exposure. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable. And remember how smoke from fires filled the huts? Combine that with damp, cold air, and you had lungs that sounded like broken bagpipes by the age of 30. Frostbite was common too. Fingers, toes, ears. Sometimes people just lived with it. You lose a few toes? That's just medieval life. Nobody's running a marathon anyway. Religion and the cold. Here's a fun twist. Religion also shaped how people dealt with winter. Cold was often seen as a kind of test from God. Enduring it patiently was considered virtuous. Monks sometimes deliberately embraced the cold as a form of discipline, sleeping without fires to prove their devotion, which is one way of saying, I am holy and also slowly dying. At the same time, religious festivals helped break up the season. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, all midwinter events. Feasts, church services, and rituals at least gave people something to look forward to during those endless frozen nights. For us, a bad night means tossing and turning for a few hours. For them, it could feel like surviving a small eternity in a smoky hut. So why did medieval winters feel so brutal? Because they were. Climate shifts, poor insulation, bad food supply, and the general fragility of human bodies meant survival itself was an accomplishment. Every morning someone woke up alive, they probably counted it as a win.
So, we've covered the huts, the climate, the straw, the hunger. Now let's add some texture. Because medieval people weren't just lying there in misery every night. Well, not always. They came up with clever tricks, shared stories, and occasionally left us written complaints about how awful it all was. And thanks to scribes, monks, and the occasional grumpy noble, we actually have little windows into what their nights were like. Hot stones, the poor man's space heater. One classic hack was the heated stone. Simple, effective, mildly dangerous. You'd warm a stone by the fire, then wrap it in cloth or straw and stick it at the foot of your bed. It worked like a primitive hot water bottle, radiating heat for a couple of hours. Of course, the risk was burning your foot off if you didn't wrap it well enough. But hey, frostbite or fire, pick your poison. Nobles upgraded this concept with brass or iron bed warmers. These were little pans filled with hot coals, slid under the sheets before bed. They made the bed toasty, but also carried the fun risk of setting your mattress on fire while you slept. Nothing like drifting off with the gentle thought, will I die of cold or combustion tonight? Hang there. Medieval clothing wasn't just robes and hoods. It was actually pretty stylish and well made for its time. Their linens were an extremely common fabric and usually bleached white by the sun, which gave the owner the brightest white clothes that could not be hidden.
Layering, the medieval burrito method. If you've ever slept in your hoodie, socks, and coat, congratulations, you've reenacted medieval fashion. People layered everything they had. Cloaks, spare tunics, even sacks stuffed with straw were draped over sleepers. Families were basically rolling burritos of wool and mud-stained linen. The real fancy trick was a bed curtain. Even in small homes, some people tried to hang spare cloth around sleeping areas. It didn't just give privacy, it trapped heat.
Nobles took this further with heavy velvet or wool drapes on four-poster beds, turning the space into a kind of medieval tent sauna. Which sounds luxurious until you realize they also trapped smells. Small price to pay for toes that stayed attached. Personal accounts, frozen ink and midnight muttering. We know from monks' diaries that winter nights were tough. One monk in the 9th century grumbled about how hard it was to write because the ink literally froze on the page. Imagine trying to copy scripture while shaking so badly the S looks like a squashed worm. Peasants didn't leave many personal notes. Literacy wasn't their strong suit. But church records and legal documents drop hints. Court cases mentioned theft of firewood in winter, suggesting people were desperate to keep fires going at night. Others talk about people collapsing in barns, too weak or too cold to make it home, essentially turning barns into emergency medieval hostels. Noble households, on the other hand, sometimes left letters whining about winter. One French noblewoman wrote that she couldn't sleep because her room was so drafty the candles wouldn't stay lit. Poor thing. Meanwhile, peasants down the road were cuddling chickens for survival. Kids' games and lullabies. Kids in huts often had to sleep early, mostly because the adults wanted them unconscious and quiet. But parents did try to soothe them. Lullabies are one of the few cultural relics we still have. Many medieval lullabies are surprisingly dark. They warned kids to hush, or wolves and witches would come get them. Sleep tight, little Hans, or the devil will drag you away. Sweet dreams. As for games, kids probably whispered and played in the straw until adults yelled. With no toys, fun usually meant throwing things, tickling, or pestering siblings. So basically, kids haven't changed in 800 years. Dreams, the midnight TV. With no Netflix, dreams were prime entertainment, and people took them seriously. Dreams were thought to be messages from God, warnings, or even glimpses into the future. Priests sometimes offered dream interpretations, and manuals circulated on what different symbols meant. So when little Gertrude dreamed of bread, maybe it meant abundance was coming. More likely, it meant she was hungry because dinner was just barley gruel. Either way, the idea that dreams had meaning gave people something to talk about during those long, dark winter nights. Last night, I dreamed of a crow. Oh, that means you'll have bad luck. Or, it means you inhaled too much smoke before bed.
Midnight noises and ghost stories. The night wasn't just cold, it was creepy. In villages with no streetlights, darkness was absolute, and absolute darkness breeds imagination. Wolves howled outside. Creaking wood made people swear the devil was lurking. Stories of ghosts, witches, and demons were swapped by firelight, and then everyone tried to sleep without wetting themselves. Some households actually prayed specific protection prayers before bed to keep demons from disturbing their sleep. And if you think that's just religious overkill, remember, when your only light is a flickering tallow candle and a cow snorts in the corner, you will believe in ghosts too. Sleeping positions, not as random as you think. We often imagine people just collapsing wherever, but there was actually method. Parents kept children in the middle of the bed pile, safe from drafts and from rolling into the fire. Adults lined the outside. Elders and servants often got the worst spots, against the wall, where frost crept through. And yes, spoony cuddling wasn't invented by modern rom-coms. Families instinctively curled up against each other. It wasn't about romance. It was survival. The bigger the pile, the better the heat. Think of it as medieval human Tetris. Sleepwalking, night terrors, and medical advice. Believe it or not, medieval medical texts gave advice on sleep issues. If you had nightmares, doctors blamed bad digestion or evil spirits. The cure? Better diet, prayers, or wearing charms to bed. Sleepwalking was considered spiritual, sometimes demonic. which must have been terrifying when Uncle Henry got up and wandered into the snowy night barefoot. Doctors also warned against eating certain foods before bed. Beans, for example, supposedly caused disturbing dreams. Which is hilarious, because beans were one of the few affordable winter foods. So basically, peasants were doomed to both hunger and nightmares. So what do we learn? Medieval people didn't just lie there shivering, they improvised. Heated stones, bed curtains, cuddling livestock, and telling each other dream prophecies were all ways of surviving those endless freezing nights. And yes, sometimes it worked. Other times, not so much. But what shines through is how communal it was. Sleep wasn't private. It wasn't luxurious. It was family, animals, warmth, and noise all crammed together. A far cry from the modern idea of a calm, silent bedroom with blackout curtains.
So far, we've been shivering in huts and piling on scratchy blankets. But now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Who slept with whom? And no, not in the fun gossip way. I mean, literally, who shared beds, how it reflected social rank, and what happened when you were on the road and had to deal with medieval inns. Spoiler, it wasn't glamorous. Sleeping was public, not private. The modern idea of everyone having their own cozy little bedroom, not medieval. Not even close. Privacy was for kings, and even they didn't get much. For peasants, the family bed was the family bed. One room, one fire, one pile of bedding. Children, parents, sometimes grandparents, and yes, sometimes unrelated people too. You couldn't exactly say, "Sorry, Uncle Peter, get your own Airbnb." Housing space was limited and warmth was survival. So people slept where there was room. End of story. Even in castles, the idea of solo bedrooms wasn't common. Great halls often doubled as dormitories. Servants, guards, and retainers slept on floors, benches, or pallets. Nobles had private chambers, but attendants often slept nearby, sometimes literally at the foot of their bed. Congratulations, you're the Duke of Burgundy and you still can't get rid of the guy snoring next to your boots. Bed sharing etiquette. Sharing a bed wasn't seen as odd. It was normal. Travelers who stopped at someone's house would often be offered space in the bed, right next to the host. Friends, siblings, apprentices, even total strangers might end up sharing a mattress. If you were warm and unconscious, you didn't complain. Of course, there were rules. You were expected to behave. Kicking, hogging blankets, or snoring too loudly were social crimes. And yes, there were occasional scandals when bed sharing went beyond just keeping warm. But generally, the medieval mindset didn't link sleeping together with impropriety the way we do today. Inns, the worst sleepover of your life. Now let's talk about inns. You might think, ooh, a medieval inn, cozy hearth, warm stew. No. Medieval inns were often overcrowded, noisy, and deeply unhygienic. Beds were shared between strangers. You, a merchant, and two other random travelers might end up under the same blanket, all suspiciously trying to avoid lice. And yes, you could pay extra for a private bed, but even then, it wasn't guaranteed to be clean. One 16th century traveler complained that inn beds were so alive with bugs that one might have thought the sheets were moving of themselves. Charming. Add in drunk patrons singing downstairs, livestock parked in the yard, and the occasional thief sneaking through, and you've got the medieval version of a one-star roadside motel.
Monks and monasteries. Monastic life added another layer to the sleeping story. Monks lived communally, often in large dormitories called dormitoria. Picture rows of narrow pallets, each monk with his own little straw mattress, but no curtains, no privacy. Everyone went to bed and woke up at the same time, often roused by bells for midnight prayers. It was less restful sleep and more scheduled napping between religious duties. Some orders even forbade the use of mattresses, insisting monks sleep on hard boards or just straw. Because apparently the cold wasn't enough suffering already, you had to spiritually earn your back pain. Soldiers and sleeping on campaign. Armies in winter? Miserable. Soldiers often slept in tents, but tents didn't stop the cold. Blankets were thin, food was scarce, and fires were dangerous in crowded camps. Many soldiers simply huddled together for warmth, using cloaks as blankets. Accounts describe frostbite, sickness, and whole units weakened by endless nights of poor sleep. If you think your camping trip last year was rough, imagine it with chainmail, dysentery, and no marshmallows. Royal households, still cold, but fancier. Now, kings and queens did try to improve the situation. Their beds were often massive, draped in layers of velvet and lined with fur. But, as we mentioned earlier, castles were drafty. Curtains around the bed weren't just for romance. They trapped heat. Without them, even royalty risked waking up with ice forming on their pillow. And let's not forget, monarchs rarely slept alone. Attendants were always nearby, ready to serve. Sometimes favorites or lovers shared the bed. Other times, political alliances were sealed by literal bed sharing. It wasn't always about intimacy, but about trust and symbolic closeness. Imagine your boss asking you to share a bed because it builds team spirit. That's medieval politics for you. Servants and the hierarchy of warmth. Sleeping arrangements reflected social rank very clearly. Nobles slept on raised beds with curtains. Servants often slept on the floors, near doors, or in lofts. The closer you were to power, the closer you were to warmth. Being a personal servant to a lord or lady wasn't glamorous, but at least you got to sleep inside, near the fire. The poor shepherd boy 2 huts down? Not so lucky. In some households, servants slept in the same room as their masters, partly for convenience, partly for surveillance. Trust was rare, and nothing said loyalty like someone snoring 10 feet away from you every night.
Bedbugs, lice, and other roommates. No discussion of medieval sleeping would be complete without mentioning the bugs. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Blankets and straw mattresses were rarely washed. Soap was scarce, so yes, everyone was itchy. Some medical texts from the time even gave advice for dealing with lice, usually involving herbs, vinegar, or prayers. Spoiler, none of it really worked. If you were asleep in medieval Europe, something was probably crawling on you. Inns versus home. Which was worse? It's almost funny. At home, you were crammed into a hut with family and livestock. At an inn, you were crammed into a bed with strangers and lice. In monasteries, you were crammed into a dormitory with 50 monks. Privacy was basically a luxury nobody had. The choice wasn't private bedroom or not. It was, whose snores are you willing to tolerate tonight? So, what's the takeaway? Sleeping arrangements in medieval winters weren't just about warmth. They mirrored the entire structure of society. Family unity meant literally piling together. Servitude meant giving up comfort for proximity to masters. Hospitality meant sharing a bed with a stranger. And religious devotion meant shivering in unheated dormitories while chanting prayers at 2 a.m. It wasn't just survival. It was culture, hierarchy, and a very itchy social contract.
So, we've been talking about the logistics of sleeping in huts, inns, and monasteries. But here's the thing. Medieval people weren't just battling the cold. They were also battling the dark. Not just literal darkness, but the things they believed lurked inside it. Because in their worldview, nighttime wasn't peaceful. It was dangerous, mysterious, and full of things that went bump in the frost. Darkness
equals danger. Let's start with the obvious. Before gas lamps, before flashlights, before that one friend who insists on carrying a headlamp to every camping trip, nights were really dark. No street lights, no glowing phone screens, just fire, moonlight, or nothing. And when it's that dark, your imagination fills in the gaps. Every creak of the wooden walls, every rustle of straw, every howling wind outside, it all felt like something watching you, which is probably why so much medieval folklore tied night to demons, witches, and restless spirits. The night hag problem. One of the most famous medieval sleep fears was the idea of a night hag. This was the belief that a demonic figure, often imagined as a witch or ghostly old woman, would sit on your chest at night and suffocate you. Sound familiar? Yep, that's basically medieval sleep paralysis. Imagine waking up in your drafty hut, half asleep, unable to move, and feeling like someone was pressing down on your chest. You'd assume it was a hag because what else could it be? Medicine hadn't exactly caught up to explain REM cycles. Some texts warned you to pray before bed to keep the hag away. Others suggested charms or herbs like hanging fennel or St. John's wort near your pillow. Personally, I think fennel would just keep vampires out of your soup. But hey, whatever helped you sleep.
Dreams as divine messages. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were portals. For medieval people, a dream could be a sign from God, a warning from saints, or, less helpfully, a trick from the devil. This meant that waking up from a weird dream in the middle of the night wasn't just unsettling, it could be a theological crisis. Do you confess it? Do you ignore it? Do you call the local priest and say, "I dreamed about a giant chicken"? Is that a sin? Medieval dream manuals actually existed, listing symbols and their supposed meanings. Spoiler, most of them involved either fortune or doom, because those were the only two moods medieval Europe knew. Midnight equals danger hour. Now, let's talk about timing. Night was often divided into watches, chunks of hours when people were expected to sleep, pray, or work. Midnight was seen as particularly risky. This was when demons were thought to be most active. The devil, witches, and restless souls were believed to roam more freely at this hour. If you woke up around then, which you probably did thanks to segmented sleep, you might light a candle, say a prayer, and hope you weren't about to be cursed. In monasteries, monks were actually scheduled to get up at midnight for prayers, which meant they spent what was supposed to be the danger hour chanting in cold stone chapels, basically singing themselves through the spooky vibes. Protective charms and rituals. Of course, people tried to fight back against the dangers of the night. Some households placed iron objects near the bed, believing iron repelled evil spirits. A knife under the pillow, for example, wasn't necessarily for stabbing burglars, it was to keep away demons. Crucifixes and holy water were also common, and in some regions, people believed you should never sleep with your feet pointing toward a door, because that's how corpses were carried out. Basically, aligning yourself like a dead body was just asking for bad luck. Witchcraft and nighttime fears. Witchcraft fears often tied into sleep. Witches were believed to fly at night, to curse people while they slept, or to steal children straight from their cradles. If your baby cried all night or seemed sickly in the morning, the explanation might not be teething or colic, it might be that a witch had ridden the child during the night. Comforting, right? This made mothers especially protective of infants at night. Cradles were often kept close to the bed, sometimes literally attached to it, so that the baby could be soothed quickly or defended against supernatural kidnappers.
Astrology and sleep. Another layer to all this was astrology. The stars weren't just pretty lights. They were seen as cosmic indicators that influenced health, moods, and, yes, sleep.
Medical texts might advise you not to sleep under certain moon phases, or that your dreams would be more prophetic when certain planets aligned. Medical doctors in the medieval Islamic world, who heavily influenced European medicine, even wrote about sleep as being tied to the balance of bodily humors. Too much cold or wet in your system, you'd sleep poorly. Too much heat, nightmares. Basically, your horoscope and your phlegm could team up to ruin your night. Noises in the night. Imagine it's winter. You're in a hut with creaking beams, straw mats, and maybe some pigs in the corner. The wind howls, snow shifts off the roof, someone snores. To modern ears, that's just background noise. But to medieval villagers, it could easily be a sign. A knocking sound, a restless ghost, a screeching owl, a death omen. This is why bedtime prayers were so long. People wanted to armor themselves spiritually before lying down in what felt like a haunted forest shack. Folk remedies for better sleep. So what if you couldn't sleep? Today, we might count sheep or scroll through cat videos until our eyes burn. Medieval people had other methods. Some remedies included drinking warm milk mixed with honey, which is surprisingly timeless. Others involved herbal pillows, stuffing your bedding with lavender, chamomile, or hops to induce drowsiness. In fairness, that one actually works. More questionable methods included rubbing goose fat on your temples or sleeping with a roasted onion near the bed to draw out bad vapors. Honestly, I think that would just give you weird onion dreams. The emotional weight of winter nights. We can't forget how long those winter nights were. In Northern Europe, darkness could last 14 to 16 hours. That's a lot of time to kill with nothing but firelight, prayers, and scratching straw mattresses. For many, nights were emotionally heavy. Fear of spirits, fear of cold, fear of sickness, all of it piled up. It's no wonder that the idea of sleep became so layered with meaning. Falling asleep wasn't just resting. It was surrendering to a vulnerable state, hoping you'd wake up alive and uncursed in the morning.
So the medieval night was crowded. Even when you're asleep, you weren't alone. In your bed, you had your family or strangers. In your straw, you had lice. In your imagination, you had witches and night hags. And in your soul, you had the constant reminder that the dark was dangerous and that the safest thing you could do was mutter a prayer and hope for the best. So yes, people survived brutal winters in wooden huts, but they also survived the night terrors that came free with every drafty bedroom. By now, we've seen how medieval nights were cold, crowded, and occasionally haunted by imaginary hags. But the story doesn't stop there. Over centuries, little changes in architecture, furniture, and social expectations began nudging people toward what we might recognize today as modern sleep. It wasn't an overnight shift, but more of a centuries-long snooze button, gradually reshaping the way people curled up during those winters. The chimney revolution. Let's start with the real game changer, chimneys. Early medieval huts and halls had central hearths, just open fires burning in the middle of the room, with the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. Romantic if you're picturing a Tolkien tavern, but in reality, smoky, inefficient, and not great for anyone's lungs. The introduction of chimneys, starting around the 12th century and spreading more widely later, was a revelation. Suddenly, fires could be built into walls. Rooms could be heated more evenly, and best of all, the smoke didn't suffocate you while you slept. This meant that multi-room houses became more practical, since each room could have its own fireplace. And with more rooms came the slow birth of, wait for it, bedrooms. From communal halls to private spaces. In earlier centuries, the Great Hall was the social and sleeping hub. Everyone, family, guests, servants, might end up snoozing in the same cavernous space. Some on pallets, some on benches, the lucky few on beds with curtains. But as chimneys spread and houses expanded, elites started carving out private chambers. At first, this was just for nobles. A lord and lady might have their own heated room, while their attendants still camped outside the door. But over time, wealthier merchants and townsfolk began building homes with multiple heated chambers too. Privacy was slowly creeping in, literally walled off by bricks and mortar. So instead of being stuck with grandma's snoring and the sheep bleating by the hearth, you might finally get a quieter night, assuming you could afford the construction bill.
Beds get an upgrade. We've talked about straw pallets and the occasional feather mattress. But as domestic life changed, so did the bed itself. By the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, the bed was evolving into a true status symbol. We're talking carved wooden frames, elaborate headboards, canopies, and drapes that trapped warmth while also screaming, "Look how rich I am!" Beds were so valuable, they were often listed in wills, passed down like family jewels. Some were so massive and ornate, they looked more like small stages than sleeping furniture. Imagine dozing off in a bed that weighed more than your entire hut. For those lower down the ladder, bedding also improved gradually. Straw was refreshed more often, simple wooden frames kept sleepers off damp floors, and textiles became more accessible, meaning more layers, more blankets, and slightly fewer frozen toes. Curtains, warmth, and drama. We can't overstate how important bed curtains were. In a drafty stone room, closing those curtains could mean the difference between shivering all night and actually feeling cozy. But curtains also carried symbolic weight. They made the bed a semi-private space, even within a shared chamber. For nobles, the curtained bed became almost like a throne, a stage where births, political audiences, and even deaths took place. Some monarchs received courtiers from their beds, sitting upright among pillows and velvet, as if holding royal office hours in pajamas. So in a way, curtains were both insulation and medieval Zoom backgrounds. They shielded you from drafts and from the indignity of being seen drooling in your sleep. The slow death of communal sleeping. As architecture improved and wealth spread, the cultural idea of privacy gained ground. By the late medieval and early modern periods, we start to see households moving away from everyone piling into one room. Servants might still sleep nearby, but families increasingly separated themselves. This didn't mean the end of bed sharing entirely. Inns remained communal disasters well into the 17th century, and poorer households still doubled up. But the dream of a personal sleeping space was slowly becoming a reality.
The clock sneaks in. Another subtle shift came with timekeeping. In the early Middle Ages, the rhythm of sleep was tied to natural light and church bells. You woke with the sun or the sound of monks chanting. But as mechanical clocks spread in the 14th and 15th centuries, people became more aware of time as something measured, not just felt. This fed into changing sleep patterns. Segmented sleep, that medieval two-phase system of first sleep and second sleep, started to blur. With more artificial light, candles, oil lamps, eventually street lamps, evenings stretched longer and people stayed up later. The strict midnight gap began to fade, paving the way for the continuous 8-hour sleep we now idealize. So, the next time you check your phone at 2 a.m. and feel guilty, just remember, your medieval ancestors would have considered that completely normal. Urban life and noise. As towns grew, so did nighttime noise. If you lived in a busy medieval city by the later centuries, you might hear carts rumbling, watchmen calling the hour, or tavern-goers staggering home. This was both good and bad. On one hand, you were less isolated, less likely to feel haunted by silence. On the other hand, good luck falling asleep while your neighbor decides midnight is the perfect time to empty chamber pots into the street. Urban living forced people to adapt their sleep habits again, more emphasis on shutters, on thicker walls, and eventually on the desire for quieter, more personal bedrooms. Religion relaxes a little.
We also can't ignore that attitudes toward sleep itself softened over time. Early medieval Christianity was pretty strict. Sleep was suspicious, idleness was sinful, and too much dozing was practically a gateway drug to eternal damnation. But by the later Middle Ages, things eased. Writers acknowledged that rest was necessary for health. Doctors began emphasizing balance. Too much or too little sleep could cause illness, but moderate, comfortable rest was a good thing. Slowly, the stigma around enjoying your bed began to fade. It turns out, even monks couldn't stay pious on 3 hours of straw-scratching insomnia forever.
Winter nights slowly tamed. So what did all this mean for winter? Well, it meant that over time, surviving the cold got a little easier. Chimneys trapped heat more effectively. Beds became softer and warmer. Curtains shielded you from drafts. And the very idea of having your own room meant you weren't always relying on Uncle Peter's body heat to get through January. This didn't erase the hardship. Medieval winters were still brutal. But it shifted the experience from raw survival to something slightly more bearable, at least for the wealthier classes. And perhaps just as importantly, it laid the groundwork for our modern obsession with bedrooms, mattresses, and bedtime rituals. The simple act of tucking yourself in at night, alone, in a warm space, with privacy, is a luxury that took centuries to build. So what's the legacy? From smoky huts to grand curtain beds, the medieval story of sleep is really the story of society evolving. Cold winters forced people to innovate. Architecture reshaped intimacy, and cultural shifts slowly carved out the idea of privacy. If the medieval night was once a communal, chaotic mess, the post-medieval night was moving towards something calmer, more personal. And yet, in some ways, we're still haunted by the old rhythms, the segmented sleep, the midnight worries, and the superstitions we don't even realize we've inherited. So, next time you curl up under your duvet in a heated room, remember, it took about 500 years of smoky fires, itchy straw, and midnight prayers to get you there.